Sure.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for joining me. You are chair of the Public Art Commission in Amherst, is that right?
Correct. Thanks for having me, Pete.
My pleasure, and thanks for agreeing to talk about the Percent for Art bylaw. And I'll start off with the elevator talk. What's the Percent for Art in a nutshell?
So the town of Amherst, before the Percent for Art bylaw, had never set aside any money or spent any money directly to support the arts. And one of the members of the Public Art Commission before I joined, actually several members had come up with the idea of creating a Percent for Art bylaw, emulating the bylaw in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which we could talk about in a minute, that would create a mechanism legally for the town to fund and to have to fund art projects. And the way Percent for Art bylaws work, and they have them at states, at the state level in various states, including Massachusetts, and also towns adopt them, is that typically they take a portion of the capital budget that would go toward typically big building projects, park projects, new construction, sometimes renovation, and set aside a percentage of those budgets to have on-site or sometimes even off-site works of art included in those projects. So the Percent for Art bylaw in Amherst that we ultimately adopted is actually 0.5% of all public construction projects over $1 million will be set aside for a work of public art on the site of that project.
And is that what they already do in Cambridge, or is the Cambridge law slightly different?
It's essentially what they do in Cambridge. Not quite the same thing.
Okay. And so who drafted this? I know that you weren't sort of present at the creation, but you became a part of the Art Commission, and then you got involved when this was already partway through the sausage making machine.
That's right.
Who got this, to mix metaphors, who got this off the ground, and at what point did you get involved in the revising or moving it forward? Yeah.
So when I moved to Amherst, I ran for and was elected a town meeting representative. And when I was serving, and this was in 2017, I believe, I can double check, the Percent for Art bylaw, which was originally drafted by Eric Brody, the previous chair of the Public Art Commission, working with the commission, came for its second hearing before town meeting. And I was so excited by the bylaw that after we voted for and passed it, and again, the history of all this is a little bit convoluted, so I can go back. But anyway, I went up to Eric after the town meeting, because Eric had presented it before we voted on it, and said, "This is great, how can I be involved?" And he said, "Join the Public Art Commission." And so I joined the Public Art Commission with the express intent of enacting the bylaw that had passed, the bylaw that he and the commission had drafted. Unfortunately, things didn't quite work out that way.
Yeah, and just to refresh memories or introduce students to this event, the town meeting was the town of Amherst's legislative body, and then it vanished and was replaced by a town council. So we still have a manager, and we now have a town council, but no more town meeting. Correct. So was that when things came to a screeching halt, or what happened when town meeting went away?
Let me step back a few steps. So I think it was, I'm going to look back at my notes here to get the dates right. It was in 2016 that the commission had worked on and presented its original draft of a Percent for Art bylaw to town meeting. So that was 2016. That was before I was on town meeting, the year before. When it was presented before town meeting said to the petitioners, Eric and the members of the Public Art Commission, "Hey, we like this bylaw, but it doesn't have any provisions for the performing arts in it. It's just for visual arts on site. Can you redraft it or come up with something that would account for performing arts, because we love our performing artists as much as we love our visual artists here." So they said, okay, and they took it back to the drawing board. And they added back into the bylaw a provision for a fund that would fund not only works on site, but potentially performing artworks that could happen either on site or off site. So this was in response directly to the desires of town meeting, and that was the kind of brief that they were sent back to kind of work on and you know. So anyway, so when it came back the following year, which was when I was on town council, it had this new piece to it, which was to create a fund that would actually hold money for a certain period of time. I forget what the original amount of time was, but it was beyond the typical amount of time, which is just for one budget cycle or 1 year. And it could be used for performing art projects. If it hadn't been used by a certain amount of time, that money would have reverted to the general fund. So anyway, they added that provision to it. With that new provision, it passed town meeting. Now what happened was, you know, Amherst voted town meeting out and voted this much smaller town council in. And this piece of legislation happened in one of the last town meetings before the town council was seated. And in the interim, in the transition period, the bylaw had to go, because of this piece, this special fund that was trying to be created, it had to go through the state legislature. And it got through I may not remember this exactly right. It got through the House, the state House, and then it was going up to the Senate, at which point the Attorney General's office took a look at it, and they said, they didn't say you can't do this, but they raised some questions, and they had some, it was like a red flag the way this fund was set up, because it was very untypical and not how these things usually work. Usually the budgeting is done for the year, and then the next year, you know, you do a new budget and you don't really carry money over, typically, except for rainy day fund things for general operating expenses, things like that. So they were just asking us why we wanted to do this. Do we want to do it this way? Why couldn't the money just be appropriated on a yearly basis for these kinds of projects, et cetera, et cetera? And that came back to the Public Art Commission, at which point we wrote our own answers to those questions and sent them to the town manager, and I believe we sent our answers back to the Attorney General as well. But the town didn't really act on the query, because the council hadn't been seated, or it was just seated, and the town manager, I guess, felt like he didn't want to act on it without the input from the new council. So basically it got caught in limbo, and by the time the council took it up, as far as the town manager was concerned, that old bylaw was essentially dead, because it didn't make it through the legislation within the year. And apparently that was enough to at least put it in limbo, if not render it not legal. So there was some question about that in our minds. But anyway, the long and short of it is that the commission did go to the council and eventually was able to present the situation before the full council, explaining to them, many of them had already understood because they had been in town meeting, but what had happened, how the bylaw had been passed and then fallen into limbo. And they were willing to allow us to rework it again. We had a sponsor on the council, Kathy Shade, so that she's a counselor, so that made it possible, because she had to present the topic so that it would be heard before the council, and then she had to sponsor the legislation ultimately.
I see. So are we sure that the version that town meeting enacted, is that dead, or it sounds like we have to replace it? The council has to act again. Is that because the thing that they passed just is unenforceable, or is this out of an abundance of caution?
Well, it's not even that it was unenforceable. It's that it never had the funding structure to make it even possible. So okay. It just was never really enacted. So the way the story all ends is that the council ultimately will pass a revised version of the bylaw. So we have a bylaw in the books now. We can get to the end point in a minute, but that original bylaw, it's not only that it was questionable whether it could be, there was no place to put the money for this component of it. The state never approved that, and we never went back to the state and asked them to approve it, because in the end we took that piece out of it.
Okay, so that's not in version 2.0, 3.0, whatever version we're working with now does not have this separate fund.
Correct. So essentially what happened is we went before, so with Kathy Shane's sponsorship, I was able to present the story to the council, and then the council listened, and then they referred us back to 3 other subcommittees of the council for their consideration. And what came out of that was that we were able to form an ad hoc working committee. So where they would have members of the council, myself from the commission, Eric Brody, who was actually no longer on the commission, but because he was the original drafter, he got to sit in on that. And we got to work together to both look back at the history of what had happened, understand why it happened, and then try to create a bylaw that could then be represented to the council that they could pass, that would hold water legally, and that wouldn't have the same issues potentially that the previous version had.
And the previous version only had this special fund provision because at town meeting, that's what town meeting members said they wanted. And this was to do with the performing arts piece, right? So the original version that the Public Art Commission presented to town meeting didn't have this this funding or rather this trust fund or separate fund. It was sort of a clean bill. So is the latest version simply the original version, or is it dramatically different?
It's pretty different. So the original version, I believe the trigger was something like projects $250,000 or over. Again, I'm not entirely sure. The new version, the trigger is $1 million. The provisions for performing arts have been removed completely. And so essentially what happens is when the project is bonded, the piece of public art is just bonded out with the project. So no money is carried over in a separate fund outside of the money that's being set aside for the construction project. It's just folded into that. And that's typically how these things will work. There's other ways of doing these as well. I mean, Cambridge appropriates money for the arts every year. They have several mechanisms for funding the arts. Cambridge is a much wealthier town than Amherst. And so they have a lot more money to play with, I suppose. So those are, okay, so let me backtrack for a second. So we got rid of the provision of so the Public Art Commission did not want to. We were happy to add that provision, and we wanted to see that happen. We wanted performing arts to be included in this. Sure. So we were sad to see that go, but we couldn't find a good way around it, and we didn't think we would have council support. I mean, basically this acting finance manager of the town couldn't find a way that we could make it work, or that she was willing to sit down and try to make that work easily. And the town, it didn't seem like the council would go for yearly appropriations for the arts. And in a way, the commission didn't really want that. We want a mechanism that automatically creates kind of funding for the arts so that it doesn't have to come up every year and be dickered over and shot down because other priorities are more important. So, two of the big, well, the three big changes are that we got rid of the provision for the performing arts. We raised the trigger threshold to $1 million, but that seemed fairly reasonable anyway, because the kinds of public construction projects you want to have a big work of public art in, they tend to be over $1 million by their nature. Right. And then the last piece, though, is that we provided basically an off button, so that the council, should they ever not want to or feel like the town would be put in financial danger by adding this cost or including this cost in a big capital project, could say, for this, we're not going to do it, or, we don't have the funding to do it right now.
But they have to have a positive.
That was really the make or break, I think, in a way. I don't think it would have passed the council if we hadn't included that. That really won over some of the skeptics on the council. And we didn't have a lot of leverage to say, you can't have that in there. So it was a bit of I think, a deal breaker for some very influential council members. And we didn't, there wasn't much we could, if we wanted this thing to pass, it had to include that piece.
Yeah, and the way it's passed is, or the new version is, the default setting is a % will go to the project and to move away from that default, the council has to take an affirmative vote to opt out.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
And what kind of projects are we talking? What kind of capital projects are in the pipeline that this could actually be used in connection with?
Right. So there are the big four projects, certainly, which is the new elementary school, the new DPW and fire buildings, or big renovation projects for those. And then the Jones Library, although that is not entirely clear because the town doesn't own the building. So there's still some details to be worked out. But in fact, the North Common renovation project, it looks like the budget on that's coming in at about $2 million. And obviously a public park like that is the perfect place for public art. And so, the working assumption now is that it will be included as part of that project. And so that should be the first one.
Okay. And having the art on site at a place like a park makes perfect sense. But what about the DPW building? Does the public art have to be at the DPW building, or can it be somewhere else?
So that the DPW building in particular was a big point of contention, and one of the things that really led several councilors to push for this off button, because they're like, well, do we really want the public trooping through the DPW? Will the public come to the DPW, et cetera, et cetera? So I actually showed a number of examples, including in New York at the in Greenpoint at the big water treatment facility there, where they have these amazing works of public art in DPW facilities, and they serve to educate the public. And so there's certainly great public art projects that are incorporated in buildings like DPW buildings. So it's certainly possible. But that in particular, specifically the DPW, was a sticking point, I think, for a few of the councilors who were like, whatever. They didn't want people trooping around the trucks and out in the mud and stuff.
Well, what about the off-site option? Is that a possibility that you could have a percentage of the DPW's capital, that expenditure, go to a work of public art, but it could be somewhere else? It could be in Cushman or somewhere.
Yeah, so you can't. That goes back to this funding issue. So in order for it to be a legal expense, it has to be folded into the construction budget of the project. If you're trying to separate it out and do it somewhere else, then you have to create this special fund to hold money. And even whether it's for performing art or for another work of visual art, you can't do that unless you create this fund. But again, in Massachusetts, towns don't typically create these standalone funds that hold money for whatever period of time outside of the construction budget.
Okay, so that's the reason why the performing arts necessitated this separate fund, because the percent for art could only be used on site. It couldn't be,
right.
Well, the performing art would have had to always happen at the DPW, for example.
Right. Right. I mean, there's some question, like, for example, in elementary school, people have done really amazing playground projects, and whether or not and how much that would be included in the construction of the building. And that is still an outstanding question to some extent. So we do have to, when you're getting these massive state funds for the elementary school building project, typically I don't think playgrounds are included in those. And so there's some of the, these sort of levels of what's applicable and what's not will get hashed out in practice. None of that is in the bylaw. So the bylaw is written in more general terms, and then all these kinds of specifics are left for the fine details, which happen sort of outside of that.
Yeah. Okay. And here's a process question, going back to when this idea of expanding it to include the performing arts came along. When the Public Art Commission adopted that idea and came up with the notion of having to set up a separate fund, did that have to go past past the town's lawyers? Did any lawyers have did the town's lawyers sign off on this? Did they miss something? Because I would have thought that if the town's attorneys looked at this, it would have set off an alarm bell about the viability of this separate fund. Or is that just not part of the process? You don't get the lawyers involved until the Attorney General raises that red flag.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, so they certainly looked at it after we heard back from the Attorney General. So I have a ruling from them on the Attorney General's comments. and they, I mean, in part it was because they were saying we shouldn't do this as well, or they also, the town lawyers. But I don't know whether or not when a new bylaw would have been passed by town meeting or is passed by, I mean, certainly in redrafting the bylaw before it came up to the council for a vote, it did go to the lawyers.
Okay.
So I don't know whether or not that was true with town meeting, and whether or not Eric, the previous chair of the Public Art Commission, the Public Art Commission chair wouldn't have the authority to send it to the lawyer, the town manager would.
Right.
And so, but I don't know whether or not the bylaw would have gone to the town manager, who would have then sent it to the lawyer before it came up before town meeting. It was certainly the case with the revised bylaw that happened. So the ad hoc committee met. In fact, the ad hoc committee met. We then presented the revised bylaw to the council, as I remember, and then the council essentially handed it off to the town manager and said, have the lawyers take a look at it. And that's pretty much what the process was before they were going to vote on it.
Got it. Good.
Yeah.
So anything else students should know about this process, which seems to be, so not a dollar has been actually spent yet on public art, even though it started a while ago, right? So
2016, so who knows before 2016 how long the idea had been kicking around, but 2016 it first gets presented.
Yeah.
It was finally passed in 2020. It was February, late January, early February of 2020. And it won't get enacted until potentially 2022, 23, 24. So it's a very long, convoluted road from drafting the legislation to redrafting to actually seeing the fruits of it. I mean, I don't think it'll be quite a decade, but it won't be far off.
Right.
So it's, I mean, patience is necessary. And I think there was a lot of, because of the transition from town meeting to town council, that caused a lot of difficulties that may not have arose otherwise. But certainly, with the initial presentation and then the redraft having this piece added and then the redraft having this piece removed, it seems like there was time that could have been better spent if there had been some better direction at some point. But I think that's just due to the transition in town government more than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anything else we should know about percent for art before I know you've got to go prepare for an opening tonight.
I don't think so. I think, it's, it's satisfying to have been involved in a process that will hopefully bring more art to Amherst, and art that will be accessible to all people. And I think, my bit of advice, the thing that really worked for me is you really want to know your town government and know the people who are there and have good working relationships with them. And, that was the only way that this thing was really possible, and also be persistent. Those two pieces, really what made it possible was Eric and then me really just staying on top of it constantly, and in a nice way, just saying, hey, what's happening? Can we move this along? What can we do? And there's lots of moments when things got frustrating, when you get referred back to this committee or that committee, and it seemed like you're running around in circles, and there was some of that for sure. But, it's all about coalition building and about conceding things that you don't necessarily want to concede if you want to make it happen. It's hard to have a lot of leverage as a citizen relative to the government, besides voting people out of office, I suppose. So you have to be fairly flexible when it comes to working with elected officials.
Yeah, and it sounds like you don't just take a great proposal, a great model bylaw, drop it into the machine, and then stand back and wait, and automatically it comes out the other end. It's not that. That doesn't happen.
No, there's a lot of sausage making. That's happening all the time. Yeah, no, it's the exact opposite of that. So be prepared to have it be completely rewritten, I would say, is the where you should start from. And then be ready to just be fast on your toes and stay true to the original intention. I feel like, we got most of what we wanted. Nobody ever gets everything, and so that's a pretty good result.
Yeah, I'll say.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That's really helpful. And I'm going to hit the stop recording button.
Okay,
And on behalf of my students, thank you.